Hi, everybody, and welcome to our session on the sleeper seats of power state courts. Just some introductory information. A few reminders, and I'm reading, so apologies. This session is being recorded and streamed, so please stay masked while indoors, not actively eating and drinking. Seats in the back of the room, are set with some extra room for those who want a little additional space. Please keep the aisles and any marked accessibility spaces open and clear for folks that need them. Okay. So with all that dispensed, we're going to take a few minutes to introduce ourselves. My name is Kirsten Alvanatakis. My pronouns are she, her. I am the program director for inclusive democracy at Rethink Media. And what we do at Rethink is we really help to build movements through providing resources, increasing collaboration, providing messaging, research, support, training to nonprofits that work in my program area, which is money in politics and fair courts. Prior to Rethink, I was the communications director for not one, not two, but 3 state Democratic parties over the span of a decade. So that clearly demonstrates a high tolerance for pain. I had the privilege of working for 2 chairs during that time who were absolutely obsessed with state Supreme Courts. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Mark Brewer in Michigan. He was, somebody was. He was so obsessed with state Supreme Court races that when they finally managed to defeat the Republican Chief Justice of the court there, the justice's court, his car was a state car. And when he lost his race, his state car went to auction, and Mark actually went and bought his car and drove it around for many, many years after that, Cliff Taylor. So you can Google it, that's true. And then the second chair that I had the privilege of working for was David Pepper at the Ohio Democratic Party, where we had some success in 2018 and 2020, managed to elect 3 new Democratic justices to that court. So that is why I'm very excited to be talking about state Supreme Courts today, and I'd love to introduce you to our panelists. Go ahead, Renee.
Hello, hello. Can you all hear me? No. Let's see. Hello, hello, hello. Oh, there it is. All right, hello, everyone. I don't know. I'll talk loud. Hello, everyone. I'm Renee Parker Sikander. I identify as an activist and organizer, and currently the outgoing executive director of Organized Tennessee. We are a voter protection organization that primarily works in, you guessed it, Tennessee. I do a lot of work around state courts and making sure that we continue to have an independent judiciary. So I'm really excited to talk about why that work is so important and what the link is between state courts and voting rights.
Hi, y'all. My name is Melissa Price Crom. I'm the director of the North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections Coalition. Really archaic name. We've been around for like 23 years, but we're the pro-democracy coalition in North Carolina. I have been doing this lobbying and advocacy and coalition building work for over 15 years. I actually met my husband advocating for same-day voter registration together. We actually joke we have our same-day voter registration baby. And so, I've been working on courts issues for almost a decade now. We look at it as one of the prongs of a pro-democracy movement. So, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kadita Kenner. I'm the CEO of the New Pennsylvania Project. We're a voting rights organization with a primary purpose of voter registration. I'm also co-chair of Why Courts Matter Pennsylvania. We are initially founded to stop the problematic judicial nominees, particularly under the Trump administration, but then had to move to state courts and do a lot of state court work based upon what was happening in Pennsylvania around our state courts. So good to be with you today.
Hi, folks. My name is Doug Key. I'm a counsel in the judiciary program at the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is a law and policy institute based at NYU School of Law, and the judiciary program works to realize a fair and inclusive judicial system that protects fundamental rights and democratic values. And I am also really excited to talk about state courts today.
Great. All right, so let's jump right in. We'll start with a question that maybe seems simple, but it maybe isn't simple. And for the folks in the audience, maybe you're wondering, why do state courts matter? Why should everyone here care about state courts, how those judges and justices are selected or elected, and how those judges and justices are held accountable? Let's go backwards. Doug, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I can give a bit of the national perspective. First of all, state courts have, most importantly, the final word on questions of state law. They are also the courts that most people are going to interact with on a day-to-day basis. State courts hear 95% of all cases filed in the United States every year, even though probably 95% of the attention is on the U.S. Supreme Court and other federal courts. I think it's also important to recognize that we are in a moment where the U.S. Supreme Court is saying clearly that it is not going to protect individual rights unless that right has to do with guns. It is not going to ensure that the machinery of our democracy is functioning. And so that leaves us in a place where with the federal courts being led by the U.S. Supreme Court, with them saying, we're not going to do that anymore, that means that these questions that folks are used to going to the Supreme Court are going to be decided by state courts, and those decisions are going to be the final ones. And so these courts are going to play a key role in the fight going forward. I want to be clear, these courts are not going to save us. A court-centric strategy is never going to be the answer, but they're going to be part of the fight, and so it's important to think about sort of what part they will play.
Great. Khadija, do you want to respond to that as well?
I'll add on a little bit from the Pennsylvania perspective. State courts matter here in Pennsylvania. It's the place people go for justice. It could be maybe one of the better days in your life or maybe one of the worst days in your life. And so state courts matter here in Pennsylvania. And we look at our state courts and particularly our appellate courts here in Pennsylvania, and they're not really representative of the demographics here in Pennsylvania. We have 31 appellate court judges. Only 2 of those judges identify as someone being a person of color. And so when we're trying to make sure that people understand how important courts are, or that it is a place that they can go to receive justice, but they don't see themselves fully on those courts, that can cause problems. And so we spend a lot of time within Why Courts Matter, and also now with the new Pennsylvania project, just making sure people really understand the importance of the state courts. We talk about even the minor courts and call them minor courts, yet they can sentence you up to 5 years in prison. I don't call that minor. So we really need to recognize all that our state courts here in Pennsylvania can do, and knowing that we're one of the few states in the entire country that elect all of our state judges. We have the power to put these folks on the bench or take them off the bench. And so state courts matter.
Great. Melissa, do you want to talk a little bit about North Carolina courts?
Yes, so state courts can decide anything from the quality of your water and air to your education funding to the safety of your neighborhood, and they're the backstop to all of our rights and freedoms, including workers' rights, LGBTQ rights, reproductive health rights. Now, for example, one of the cases that's coming up in North Carolina that really means a lot to me is the Leandro case, is the education funding case. Our state Supreme Court has affirmed not once but twice that all children in North Carolina deserve a sound basic education. I'm a mother. I have a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 6-year-old. So I know I've had children in the public schools for the last 14 years. I'm a product of North Carolina public education, and I'm about to have a kid in the public school system for the next 12 years. So I'm really concerned about this as a mother because I've been there on the front lines. I have seen my son come home crying because his teacher had to leave for a better paying job. I've seen that there's only been one set of crumbling social studies books to share between 3 classrooms. My daughter had no Spanish teacher for weeks on end. This past year, my daughter didn't have a kindergarten teacher because of teacher shortages and the failure of our legislature to fully invest in public schools. So state courts matter to me as a person.
And that case again, what's that case called again for folks?
It's the Leandro case.
Leandro. And that's being heard before the state Supreme Court pretty soon, right?
Correct. This fall, it will be heard and decided on. In fact, a Superior Court judge had ruled that we would just take the money. We actually do have the money. It's like we have one of the largest rainy day funds in the entire country, and he basically just said, we're going to take the billions out of that and provide it to public schools. Our legislature threatened to impeach him over that. Then the Court of Appeals came and negated that, and now it's up at the state Supreme Court.
Okay, great. Renee, do you want to talk a little bit about Tennessee and the courts there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. It is my home state. It is the love of my life, and it's been really difficult to watch my state fall victim to a lot of tactics, voter suppression tactics, redistricting, all of these things that make it really challenging for Tennesseans to be able to cast a ballot. And right now, we all know that our democracy is under attack, and state courts are supposed to be independent. They're supposed to be there to protect the people. And when you have a state like Tennessee, which has a Republican supermajority, and a state legislature that is incredibly hostile, especially to voting rights, it is important that the people are able to rely on an independent judiciary. We have seen a lot of attacks in Tennessee over the last decade, but definitely within the last 2 years, that have been seeking to undermine judicial independence. We have even seen our legislature retaliate against judges for rulings that they don't like, rulings like allowing voters to be able to vote during a pandemic by absentee ballot with an excuse of COVID. When we're in the middle of a global pandemic and people are dying and people are getting sick, living in a country that values itself on our democracy, you shouldn't have to risk your life to be able to cast a ballot. And when you can't rely on the court system to be fair and impartial, who is protecting you? That is the only branch of government that is insulated or supposed to be insulated from partisan politics. And in a state like Tennessee, it's incredibly important that we have that level of protection. So seeing it under threat is incredibly alarming.
I want to jump a little bit more into what you were talking about there, and Doug alluded to this earlier, that, now that we've got Alito on the court and he decides, what he thinks the Constitution means from day to day. So, in the past, we viewed the federal judiciary really as that, place where folks sought refuge, sought protection for fundamental rights and freedoms like voting rights, like reproductive rights. They were really a firewall. And, I think perhaps now we're seeing that role shift to the states. So I want to start with Khadija. Do you want to talk a little bit about the history there with the federal judiciary, and then, again, how that role of that protector of freedoms and rights is moving perhaps to the state courts?
I sit here as a Black woman, and I know that the courts are the places we depended upon to have our rights restored or given, for us to have freedom in this country. And I think, it's sad to see what has happened to the federal courts, particularly in the last 4 some years, and how what used to be considered, or what we thought was a firewall for our protections, we can't go to the federal courts at this time and believe that we are going to get the justice that we deserve. And so that moves to the state courts. And then if you're a state like Pennsylvania, where we actually elect our judges, and now they've become partisan, we do elect them in a nonpartisan election, supposedly. But it's an issue in this moment that we cannot, really believe in the federal courts to protect us in this moment. I think about what we've done with Why Courts Matter Pennsylvania, and leading efforts to try to push back on the problematic judicial nominees that came out of the Trump administration. We organized 3 events where we went down to DC and got arrested. I've been incarcerated 3 times now, trying to stop lower court appointments, because that's where these Supreme Court justices come from. Mm-hmm. And then knowing that Pennsylvania, being one of those states in the 2020 election, where our state courts actually gave Donald Trump 1 win under the guise of what he believed to be not a fair election. So it's the state courts. It was our Commonwealth Court, one of our appellate courts here in the Commonwealth, uniquely Pennsylvanian, that gave a win. So, it's really important that we realize how the state courts are going to have to be the firewall, because if we can't count on our federal courts now to protect us in the cases that we thought were settled law, right? If we're talking about Roe v. Wade, or if we're nervous about what could happen with Loving, or if we're nervous about what could happen with Brown versus Board of Education, it'll be the state courts that will be that firewall. And so it's so important that we all connect those dots and make sure we get out and cast ballots, particularly if you're a Pennsylvanian, for these judges who will make determinations over your life even greater than what could happen in the legislative bodies.
Doug, do you want to talk a little bit about that as well? Or if there are any kind of specific examples of issues where you see this being litigated more in the state courts moving forward?
I mean, one thing we're already seeing this in the wake of Dobbs. You know, in the last month, there have been, I think we're around a dozen different state court systems see abortion access litigation working their way through the system currently, and those cases are going up and down to different levels of courts, and that's something we're going to see play out over the next 6 months or so, probably longer. With the election coming up, you are going to inevitably see more of the election challenges play out in front of state courts. So those cases, we don't know what they are yet, but they're coming. And the point Khadija made about Pennsylvania courts giving Trump a win, I think is so important. Someone did a study of all the state court decisions about election challenges in 2020, and there were a handful of states where the Trump's team got a win and a handful of states where they didn't. And what stuck out to me was all the ones where they got a win were states where the courts have been, there's sort of been a 10-year effort to politicize the courts. And so even if that win didn't last, what tells me is they've had some success because they managed to get judges on the court who are willing to accept extreme arguments, extreme views. And so I think it's really important to know that seed's already been planted a little bit. And so we're playing defense a bit.
Renee, do you want to talk a little bit about, seeing the state courts take a bigger role in protecting rights and freedoms?
Yeah. I think there's 153 bills that have been introduced in the past year. I think that's your research. Hey. 153 bills that were introduced across the country in order to weaken our state courts. This didn't just happen. This is because there is a growing importance and a growing reliance on our state courts because we have federal courts in U.S. Supreme Court who are literally opting out of protecting our freedoms. I'm going to talk about the South today, pretty much all day long.
Please do. We love
all right,
the South.
A voice for the South. In my home in the South, we see frequent attacks on people of color in various different ways, from just like working overtime to make sure that we can't access the ballot, to not caring whether or not we are protected, safe, taken care of. The people, and when I say the people, I'm primarily talking about young people, working class people, people of color, BIPOC folks. If we can't rely on our courts, who is reaching out to us? Who's protecting us? Really resonated with Khadija, talking about her experience as a Black woman and how this impacts how we feel as Black women. We have watched the courts literally give us rights for being human beings, rights that we should have had all along. As Black people, we know the importance of impartial judges. Judges who are going to see our humanity. It's also very important that we see people who look like us, who have experienced what we've experienced in these positions. And it's just a very scary reality to think, that we can have court systems, things in place that are saying, that's not our job. We're not going to protect you. If not y'all, then who? And so, yeah, especially out here in the South, it is just so critical that when we have hostile state legislatures, hostile general assemblies, folks who literally do not care about Black and brown people and will go on record saying that, that we know that there is going to be somebody who's fair, impartial, that is going to rule, and also not be in fear of ruling with the fear of retaliation. When you have judges who are afraid that if they rule impartially or rule the way that they believe that they should rule, that they can then be removed from the bench or attacked by a General Assembly. It's a very scary reality that we are currently living in, and it's getting worse. So there is absolutely a growing dependence on our state courts, and we have to do everything that we can in order to protect that.
Melissa, do you want to talk about North Carolina and state courts and protecting fundamental rights and freedoms there?
So state courts and state constitutions play a key role in protecting our rights and freedoms, especially now with SCOTUS kicking everything from redistricting to abortion access down to the state courts. So most state constitutions actually go further than the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution acts like a floor, not a ceiling. And so, and we're seeing that in North Carolina. And just to back up for a minute, in North Carolina, we have full elections of our judges. It's actually in our state constitution. And we, unfortunately, a few years became the first state to go from nonpartisan judicial elections backwards to partisan judicial elections. So full partisan judicial elections. So going back to the state constitution, so in North Carolina, we're using that state constitution to go up to the state Supreme Court and challenge. For example, with the voter ID legal challenge, we're using our equal protection clause there. And so, and that's the same with like the Leandric, we're using these, our state constitutions to ensure that our rights and freedoms are protected.
So I just want to underline that again, what you said about the floor and the ceiling. Can you say that again for folks? Because I think that's really important for
So
folks.
state constitutions are, well, the U.S. Constitution acts like a floor, not a ceiling. Many of our state constitutions actually go further than the U.S. Constitution. And that especially applies to many states in the South, because after the Civil War, we were forced to rewrite our state constitutions for good measure.
Excellent. Okay, that's a good point. And I'm going to go back to you on this one, Melissa, so just hang tight. And 'cause you alluded to this. We want to make state courts better. We want to insulate them from partisan influence. We want to insulate them from big money. What are some things that we can do, or as you said in your state, or undone perhaps, to make courts more fair, more impartial, more free of partisan influence?
Absolutely. In fact, we're relaunching our Fair Courts North Carolina campaign, and we're starting off with 3 pillars. Basically, we want to return to nonpartisan judicial elections. We don't want to force judges to run as partisan. Judges should be able to run for an election as an independent or nonpartisan. We also want to go into the judicial codes of conduct and ban judges from political activity because, and this used to be the norm in North Carolina, but judges shouldn't be out there fundraising for other candidates or like saying, I'm here recruiting, I'm the quarterback, I'm here recruiting for my team. We also are looking at recusal reform. I actually worked with Doug during my sabbatical in January 2019, and we just got Sherry Beasley to become our Chief Justice appointed, and I was like, all right, we can do this. We're going to go and work on the administrative judicial codes because you can do that. You don't just need the legislature. And we temporarily had a piece of recusal reform that when Justice Newby beat her in 2020 by 401 votes, we lost. So, recusal reform, nonpartisan judicial elections, keeping them away from political activity. I would go further than that and actually say we also need a return to, in states that do elect judges, we need a return to judicial public financing of elections. My state had that for over a decade, and the Republicans came in and got rid of it because they clearly wanted more special interest funding electing our judges. But that's not the case. We, the people, should be helping decide who our judges are, not wealthy special interests.
Renee, do you want to talk a little bit about Tennessee, and then we'll go to Doug and Katita?
Yeah, I was just relishing in that answer. That was amazing. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what happened in Tennessee and the way that my organization went about trying to make our state courts better. Excuse me. So follow me, y'all, because they took us on a journey the past couple of years.
All right, hold on, everybody.
Everybody, hold on to your seats. So 2020. Pandemic, people are dying, people are scared of getting sick. Tennessee legislature said no one is allowed to vote by mail because they're afraid of getting sick. So the people filed a lawsuit to hold our General Assembly and our state legislature accountable for keeping us safe while we are exercising our right to vote. That lawsuit went to Nashville, where our state capital is, and it was read and judged on by Chancellor Ellen Lyle, who was a judge who she's highly esteemed. She had been a judge for like 35 years, is known for ruling independently, justly, just a fantastic judge. And she ruled that all Tennesseans are allowed to vote by mail during the 2020 election if they are afraid of contracting COVID-19.
Big win.
Big
for
win.
the people.
Hey, big win for the people. So how Tennessee kind of operates is they're going to try to push forward like the most egregious legislation they can, and if you're not paying attention, it can be successful. And so once Judge Lyle ruled in favor of the people that we can vote by absentee ballot, we saw the General Assembly and our state legislature absolutely lose their minds. They were not shy about saying how partisan they believed that this judge was, that they thought that this ruling was a personal affront, a partisan attack, and that she was way outside of her bounds of power, and that it's up to the General Assembly to be able to decide whether or not we can cast a ballot in the election. So they introduced legislation to remove her from the bench, which is pretty much as bad as it can get.
So she ruled for the people, and they were like, nope, you got to go.
But now you got to go after 30 years of service. Fortunately, people heard about this, people started organizing around this, and it failed in subcommittee, thank God. But also what Tennessee is known for doing is just like rewriting the rules if they don't get their way. So even though it failed in subcommittee, we also saw, like, following that they tried pushing legislation to just create an entirely new court. And that's one of the ways that you can weaken the influence of state courts is once they rule in a way that they're not in favor with, they'll just create an entirely new court and say, we're just going to circumvent these judges and make sure we go through a different process. Alongside that, additionally, Judge Lyle ended up retiring the year after. She had been thinking about retiring previously, but she did go on record saying, like, y'all didn't make it any easier for me to do my job. There was so much attention on her, so much negativity around her. She was getting death threats. And this is for ruling in favor of the people, and so that we could exercise our right to vote. So the question, I will go back to the question, how can we make our courts better? Our response is, one, staying vigilant as hell, staying on these people. What we did in response to them coming for our chancellor, we organized people to write op-eds. We organized events. We wrote petitions. We got thousands of petition signatures for them to get off of Chancellor Lyle's back. And then also in the following, to stop pushing for this new court that was going to circumvent Nashville from having any say in decisions that are made when you file a lawsuit against the state. Tennessee literally tried to create a new court where anytime you sue the state, that lawsuit would go to a 3-judge panel, and all 3 of those judges were going to be hand-selected by our governor. And so that was going to create chaos and a problem.
So if you're suing the governor, he gets to pick the judges that decide on that case.
Absolutely.
Does that seem fair and impartial to y'all?
The absolute opposite of fair and impartial. And because we were able to organize and create this statewide effort around organizing around an independent judiciary and around Chancellor Lyle, while we didn't, I struggle with the word win because we did have wins. The governor was not allowed to handpick these judges, so that was quite a win. But we still do have this 3-judge panel where each judge from a grand division is chosen by our state Supreme Court. And so we did not get the worst version of the piece of legislation, and a lot of times that's what we're fighting for in states like Tennessee, is to make it as least bad as possible. But we still consider that a win. How terrible would it be when you're suing the governor to have to push that legislation or push that lawsuit towards judges that are hand-selected by him? And so we were able to get a win there, and that was only because of organizing. And so we have to be able to show our judges and our chancellors that we've got your back. If you are ruling in a fair and impartial way, if people come for you in the aftermath, the people are going to rise up and they're going to organize and they're not going to let you go down silently. I'm a millennial, so I keep thinking of the Chainsmokers song that's like, if we go down there, we go down together. That's in my head right now. And that's how we've got to organize. That's how we have to keep pushing back so that our judges and chancellors know that they can rule fair and impartially and there will be no retaliation.
Thank you. Doug, do you want to talk a little bit about how we can insulate state courts from, the kind of nonsense that Renee's talking about here?
I think I'd encourage folks to think creatively about the paths to reform and to protecting the courts, because it's not, because we're talking about the courts, there are some new channels that you may not already have on your mind. So first, that there's going to be legislative fights, both on the defensive, like Renee just described, but positive reform as well. Disclosure and ethics and judicial selection tweaks can all go a long way to keeping the worst aspects of money in judicial elections and political pressures on judges, keeping those things out of the process. But you may not have a legislature that's going to go along with that. So then, as Melissa said, the courts themselves have a lot of power over the rules that judges have to follow. They can set ethics and recusal rules without having to get the legislature's approval. And so even if you don't have a legislature that wants to go along, you may have a court that's interested in protecting the appearance of impartiality and would be willing to use its own rules to try and make the system better. And then I'd also encourage thinking about more informal access points. I'll tell a story from Rhode Island. We've been talking a lot about judicial elections. A lot of states, judges are appointed with or without, usually it's the governor. They have to sometimes use a nominating commission that vets and recommends judges to the governor, or sometimes the governor can do it on their own. And often, even in states that elect their judges, if a judge steps down in the middle of a term, if there's a vacancy, the governor also gets to appoint. There's not an election then, so that judge reaches the bench by appointment. And often these appointments for years have been happening under the radar. No one's paying attention. Governors think they can do pretty much whatever they want with them. So in Rhode Island, there's a vacancy on the Rhode Island Supreme Court a couple years ago, and the governor, there's been this long-standing deal where the legislature essentially gets to say who they want on the bench, and so one of their own members raises her hand and says, I want to be on the bench. So the assumption is she's going to get the seat. Progressives in Rhode Island who haven't put pressure on the governor around judicial vacancies before, they say, hey, Rhode Island has had an all-white bench for its 200-year history. There is a brilliant black woman who's been sitting in the lower courts, and she needs to be on this court. She is the one that you should be looking at to appoint. Now, in true Rhode Island fashion, the governor couldn't go back on the deal with the legislature, but the pressure was so much that the governor actually got another justice to resign, so there were two vacancies. And the advocates, the judge that the advocates thought should be on the bench got appointed to the Rhode Island Supreme Court. And all of this is because there was pressure that the governor never expected to feel around this judicial vacancy. So there are these formal channels for reform, but state courts have flown under the radar for so long that even a little bit of informal advocacy can actually go a really long way.
Kadita, I'm going to move on to the next question because I think you're going to have some good insights from Pennsylvania. So we've talked about some positive things that can be done around organizing and some reforms. What's the number one thing you're most concerned about with regard to state courts' judicial independence? What's the thing that folks should be looking out for in their states?
So let me take you on a journey like Renee took you on a journey.
Hold on to your seats.
Any of you history buffs here in the room today? Any history buffs?
Yeah.
Let me take you back to Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Chief Justice during the time of Brown versus Board of Education. This country was not exactly excited about ensuring all people have the same freedoms at that time. And they were so upset under Chief Justice Earl Warren's court that they, unanimously voted on Brown versus Board of Education, that there was a campaign to impeach Chief Justice Earl Warren. Billboards up in the sky, particularly in Decatur, wanting to impeach Justice Earl Warren. Well, let's fast forward from the 50s to 2018. Here in Pennsylvania, decision was made by the state Supreme Court here that our state legislature didn't like. And what they decided to do was try to impeach our Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices. And this was all around our gerrymandered maps here in Pennsylvania. You're all aware Pennsylvania had some of the most gerrymandered maps in the entire country. Well, our state courts ruled that they were gerrymandered, unconstitutional, and we had to create new maps here in Pennsylvania. Well, that again, not a fan of that. The state legislature, GOP-led legislature here in Pennsylvania, wanted to impeach our Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices. They failed in that effort. But what they have not failed in is weaponizing the independence of our judiciary by trying to institute lots of constitutional amendments, ballot questions that would appear on our ballots in primary elections or general elections. The one I want to talk about today is House Bill 38. We call it the Judicial Gerrymandering Bill. This is where we would no longer vote for all of the judges that we're allowed to vote for in Pennsylvania. We get to vote for all 31 appellate court judges in the statewide election. House Bill 38 would change that, so we only get to vote for 3 judges, one on the Commonwealth Court, one on the Superior Court, one on the Supreme Court. And those districts, those judges would be voted on by districts that will be created by legislators, and we know how great of a job legislators do at creating districts. So we've been fighting back against House Bill 38 now for years, because this is the workaround when they, are not seeing things go their way legislatively, and they can't move on something legislative. They're going to try to throw this to voters unfairly and ask us to change the way in which we elect judges here in Pennsylvania. So I'm really concerned about the use of constitutional amendment ballot questions because it's become a new trend where when legislation can't move in the Commonwealth, we start throwing things to voters to vote on in primary elections when we know it's the least turnout possible, right? A May primary turnout is going to be less than 30% of the folks voting. So we're really concerned about that, and it's already passed one session of both the House and the Senate in Pennsylvania. If it passes one more time before we have the new state legislators come into play, you're going to see that on a May ballot here in Pennsylvania. We've been fighting back against that successfully because it's a bad idea, it's a bad bill, but we never know what can happen if you put that bill on a ballot and word it in a way that kind of sounds good and then hope that Pennsylvanians do the right thing. Because here in Pennsylvania, we have voted yes on every single ballot referendum question that has come our way since 1996.
I want to, again, underline what you just said. So the state Supreme Court threw out gerrymandered maps. Republicans in the legislature were like, we don't like that. We like the maps that we drew. So now we're going to draw y'all into some gerrymandered maps.
Right.
Okay, that's kind of crazy. I'm from Pennsylvania, I can say that. Melissa, do you want to talk about, the things that you're concerned about? I mean, North Carolina, you could probably talk for an hour. Do you want to talk a little bit about recusal? Do you all know what recusal is? Yes? No? Do you want to talk a little bit about recusal or whatever else you want to talk about?
No.
You all got some crazy stuff going on down in North Carolina.
No, so yes, we don't have recusal reform in the entire state. So basically, a judge can just decide if they want to step aside or not. And this has been incredibly challenging because we have a recently elected Associate Supreme Court Justice, Phil Berger, Jr., who is, a Chief Justice newbie recruit, and he has refused to recuse himself from cases involving his father, Senate Pro Tem Phil Berger Jr. Sr. And so these are like cases that are, he's a defendant on, whether they be like redistricting or voter ID, and he won't recuse himself, and he's judging on his daddy, and that's just outrageous. So, but going back to the question a little bit about like what we're most concerned about, so we're also very concerned about judicial impeachment. I told you before in the Leandro case, like they were a judge made a decision, they threatened to impeach. They were threatening to impeach Justice Anita Earls coming up to redistricting cases in the fall, and they basically had this fantastic scheme that it's kind of like the evil villain when he monologues. It's like they actually told us what they were thinking of doing. It's like, okay, all right. So in North Carolina, impeachment works where like the House impeaches and the Senate, you have to get a 2/3 majority. They're like, okay, all right, we're going to impeach over here in the House. And then we're going to slow walk it in the Senate and not actually, do the trial till like after the election so that justice would be pulled from the bench until that trial. I mean, come on, guys. Just outrageous. The other thing that I am most concerned about, because, as you can tell in North Carolina, we have a 4-3 progressive majority on our bench. We're going to our courts to defend us. But that might all end. There's a little case called Moore v. Harper that is going up to the the U.S. Supreme Court from North Carolina. Sorry, y'all. Basically, they're not too happy about the redistricting maps. In the spring, our state courts made them go redraw the House, the Senate, and the congressional maps. The legislature redrew the state and House maps. Those were fine. But they called up a special master on the congressional maps. Well, that didn't make our legislature too happy. So they went and sued in federal court. And this case is based on a fringe legal proposition known as the independent state legislature theory, which asserts that the legislature has powers to set rules in federal elections without interference from state courts or other co-equal branches of government, basically saying separation of powers, see you later. So yeah, we're really concerned about this because, this is a part of a radical power grab by politicians in our state, which threatens the entire country. And it could, and this is not hyperbole, but it could be the end of all of our collective attempts to move toward a multiracial democracy in this nation.
I think that's a good point because what Kadita talked about, it doesn't just stay in Pennsylvania, right? It doesn't just stay in North Carolina. They learn, and then they take it elsewhere. They're like, oh, we were successful doing this over here. Let's try it over here. And I think that's really challenging. I want to talk about organizing because around the federal courts, around the U.S. Supreme Court, it's traditionally been very hard to organize, right? Once somebody's on the bench, they're there for life. Not a whole lot we can do about it. Everybody has these pipe dreams of, we're going to impeach Clarence Thomas over Ginny. I mean, honestly, I want it to happen just as much as all of us, but it's a hard thing to organize around because it just doesn't seem real. But Renee, what you talked about was an example of organizing around state courts. And I think that that's really powerful. So do you think that, could you have done that 5 years ago, do you think? Do you think people are more educated and they're more paying attention to these sorts of things? Do you see that changing?
Yeah, I do actually. So one of the challenges that we have seen is getting young people involved in the movement for judicial independence. It's not the sexiest topic. Like, you don't see people like dancing on like TikTok to keeping our courts independent with like a nice beat behind it, right? We should.
Does anybody do TikTok? Do you want to do a TikTok?
We can give it a try. No, but it's not the sexiest topic, right? But a lot of the reason that it's not sexy or whatever is because a lot of people don't understand. They don't know what's going on. They don't know why it's important. And so storytelling was a huge component of our organizing, was telling the story of Chancellor Lyle, talking about why that was unfair and not cool and how that's a threat to our democracy and how it relates to voting rights. I say all the time, Tennessee is not a red state. We are a non-voting state. I just kind of want to drop it there for a second because when we have trial courts and our judges are elected, popularly elected, and they serve their districts for 8 years. And we just had an election where we are electing judges. And when we have people not turning out to vote for people who are going to be representing us in our courts for 8 years, I have only been alive for 3 of those. It's a very long time. It's a very important role. And if people don't understand how important judges are to their day-to-day life, or maybe it's not their day-to-day life, but one day they may need a judge. And so one thing that really concerns me is just the normalization of partisan judges, the normalization of a Republican judge and a Democratic judge because that is the antithesis. Like that's the opposite of what our courts were intended to do. It is the only branch of government that is supposed to be insulated from partisan politics. Partisan politics is, I mean, we all know, like, we live in a society right now where everything is political, everything is politicized. And so if the one thing that was created and intended to be independent, blind, becomes partisan as well, then who do we rely on? And so it keeps me up at night, young people not recognizing and not understanding how to take action around state courts and the importance of our state courts. And so with organizing, I mean, the biggest takeaway that we had from the successes that we had was the importance of that just baseline foundational education on why it's important. One of our partners developed a brief. Our partner, Think Tennessee, developed an independent judiciary briefing that pretty much outlines the importance of state courts across the country, what type of bills have been filed across the state, what Tennessee has done to mimic a lot of those dangerous bills, and a lot of the ways that we can organize around a lot of these issues. So being able to put that in the hands of people who are willing to read and listen, but also just getting very creative about who we're asking to participate in organizing, people who traditionally don't get engaged and don't get involved, educating them, and then taking that next step on what's the action item that you're gonna do now. That organizing is really key. So yeah, like the baseline is storytelling, but also how are we organizing? Are we just using social media? Because yes, social media is critical, it has to be utilized, but that can't be the only thing that we are doing. We have to actually mobilize a movement of people taking action, people protesting, people writing, people talking, people educating their friends, family, community members. Something that I like to think about are like front porch forums, like being able to bring together your neighborhood to talk to them about what you've learned about judicial independence and what's happening right now, what bills are being pushed through right now that we need to be aware of and also need to speak out against. So yeah, organizing, storytelling, engaging young people in creative ways are critical during this time.
I want to say, too, that the idea of independent, judges that are independent of partisan influence, that's popular across the board. Republicans, for the most part, Republican judges, Republican voters, for the most part, don't want partisan judges. It's basically the lawmakers want judges. As I remember in Ohio a few years back, there was a justice who said, my job is to be the backstop for the legislature. Like, most people don't agree with that. So I think there is opportunity to organize around state courts. Do any of y'all want to talk about your states as well, organizing?
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
So let's first start off with the fact that 95% of all court cases in this country run through state courts. A few years ago, I was at this big fancy meeting in New York, and everyone's like, all right, it was about Trump in the courts, and they're like, yep, we're screwed, can't do nothing. I'm like, no. So we can organize to protect our state courts. In North Carolina, we do elect all of our judges. And so we launched the first version of the Fair Courts campaign in 2017. I actually remember our first event was in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is home to Fort Bragg. And so, I was freaking out because I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize we scheduled this on Veterans Day. And I'm calling my organizer, Val Applewhite, down there, who's actually running for the state legislature now. And I'm like, oops, do we need to reschedule this? And do you know what her response to me was? I, as a veteran, I've defended democracy abroad, and there's nothing more important for me to do on Veterans Day than to defend democracy here at home. Mm-hmm. That was the launch of the Fair Courts campaign in North Carolina. We got down to Fayetteville and were shocked to see over 100 people. We were having to go get more chairs. Our next stop was Greensboro, 200 people, and it went on like that, and we covered the state. We did over 50 different rallies, presentations, press conferences, and we got out the word about how important the courts are to everyday people, and that made a difference. We had our backs up against the wall. The Republicans had a supermajority. They could have done anything they liked, and our efforts led to them pulling back. and not actually doing some of the crazy ideas that they were thinking about doing, like legislative appointment of judges or forcing judges to run every 2 years. Most of our judges run every 8 years. Things like that. And we were able to stop some of the worst coming into our state, and it was organizing. It was getting out there in those communities, talking to people face to face, and giving them action items to do.
Yeah, Khadija, do you want to talk about PA?
Absolutely, because, to piggyback on all the things that have already been said, which are really accurate, and the storytelling is really important when you're trying to organize around the courts. And it's interesting that your person was Miss Applewhite, because we had a Miss Vivette Applewhite in Pennsylvania, who's older than 100 years old. She's voted in every single election since FDR. And she was going to risk losing her eligibility to vote based upon voter ID laws that were supposed to come down the pipeline in Pennsylvania. And so it really threatened her track record of voting in every single election since FDR. So it's really about breaking apart what it is that various courts do, right, and making them real and human for people, because we see them, the courts is just this body, and we don't know who the people are in them. We don't know what kind of cases they're really hearing. So to really make the courts real for people. So Ms. Vivette Applewhite was one. There was another young lady in her early 20s who cast a provisional ballot in Pennsylvania in the 2020 election because she didn't get her mail-in ballot in time to vote by mail. And she does what everyone is told to do, is never leave the polling location without casting a provisional ballot. Well, she got a letter saying that her vote was being contested, but it was the courts that said to her, your vote counts. So we really have to drive home to people what it is that the courts do. We're advocates out here for various issues. We may care about LGBTQ rights. We may care about economic justice. We may care about environmental justice. But the courts are part of all the things we care about. So if you care about LGBTQ rights, you better care about the courts, because it's coming down to the courts. If you care about environmental justice, care about the courts, because that issue you care about the environment is coming to the courts. Whatever issue you are about and focused on, add the courts to it as part B, 1B, to whatever your issue is. Because whatever you care about is eventually going to be heard by and arbitrated by courts, if it's federal or state. And we must start to care about them more before it's too late. We see all the folks who come out into the streets, when there's big things happening, like the overturning of Roe v. Wade. We need to be out in the streets when they're trying to not fund our schools, right? We need to be out in the streets when we don't have safe water to drink. All of these things happen on the state court level or the federal court level, and we need to make sure that we are really protecting the courts and caring about them as much as we care about every other issue we care about. Add it on. Whatever issue you care about, add the courts on.
Awesome.
Come on now.
So I love that we're giving people hope here, right? We can take action. So I want to start with Doug. We'll leave folks with something that they can do. So what's one thing everyone here can do to take action on the issue of state courts and judicial independence?
All right, I'll give 2 things. So first, find out how the judges in your state are selected. Not just the state Supreme Court, but all the way down the line, because you've heard from everyone today how important the lower court judges are as well. The Brennan Center, we have an interactive map. You can poke around your state and others and find out the answer to this question. The website is judicialselectionmap.brennancenter.org. I'm sorry for how long that is.
Wait, say that one more time.
Judicialselectionmap.brennancenter.org. You could also just Google judicial selection map, and it'll probably come up.
You got some good SEO going?
So poke around there, find out how your judges are picked. I don't know if there's someone from Alliance for Justice here, but they also just published what they're calling their State Court Hub, where you can find out information about the individual judges on your state's high courts, including when their next reappointment or reelection period is. And so I'd recommend you poke around there as well. And think about, based on that system in your state, what those access points are, because there may be more ways to influence the process than you're currently thinking about, even if it's a state that you think of as an election state. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say is connect with the lawyers in your state. I love my colleagues, but lots of us don't get the difference between state and federal courts. They get a victory in the federal courts, and they declare victory and just walk away from it. But as you've heard today, that is not the end of it in state courts. You know, there in Kansas, we saw a great 2018 decision about abortion access, but then you saw a referendum to overturn that this summer. You see judges up for retention election this fall, and they're going to face an anti-retention campaign. And so if you are bringing a major lawsuit in state court, you better be ready with a 2, 5, 10-year plan to defend that victory, because that's just how it works in the states. It's different than the federal.
Yeah, and I do have the URL for it. It's afj.org/state courts. And I just want to say, Kansas, so everybody, let's give a round of applause for the organizers in Kansas. But what Doug said there is really important, because the justices that made that decision are up for retention in November. So they didn't win at the ballot, so now they're coming back. They're like, we're going to move those justices and then win the governor's race so they can put new justices on, which is what happened in Iowa, correct? So
Yeah.
It never stops. So organizing is effective, but you need to keep doing it. I'm sorry, I don't know what else to tell you. So we'll go real quick. One thing that folks can do to take action on state courts.
They count on our ignorance. They count that we're not going to know what is happening. You must make yourself aware about what is going on with the courts. Use the resources that are out there. AFJ is one of my favorites, afj.org. Go to the Leadership Conference. Go to Brennan Center. Go to the folks who are going to give you the accurate information so you can educate yourselves about the courts. They count on our ignorance. And so we must ensure that we are educating ourselves about who these judges are who want to disperse justice on us before Election Day.
401 votes. That was the difference in our Chief Justice election in 2021. That was the difference in us having recusal reform or not having recusal reform. The voting down ballot matters. Ensure that your people don't just get out for the top ticket items. Ensure that they understand how important the state courts are to their everyday lives, and ensure that they vote down ballot.
And I'm going to piggyback off of Khadija. I loved how she said they count on our ignorance. We have to stay informed. So my action item is going to be for everyone to read the Tennessee Judicial Independence Briefing by Think Tennessee. And also get involved in, Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee. There might not be active attacks that are happening right now. A lot of states are out of session right now. But a lot of times when our state legislatures are attacking our rights, it's very quick. It's a very quick process where we need to be able to count on a group of folks who we know are educated, understand the issues, and are ready to take action, that we can call upon those folks in a time crunch and get them engaged in various activities, events, petition signings, or any ways that your skill sets can be utilized to push back against what's happening. So getting involved in organizations across states that you may normally not be involved with is really, really critical.
Awesome. So I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if folks have questions. Anybody?
Yeah, a question right here.
Yes, thanks so much. So my name is Brandy Buckman. I'm a reporter, and I've actually been a legal reporter before. And what I've noticed in the last few years is there was a shift where when we would write about judges, we would identify who they were appointed by. Mm-hmm. And the pushback that I get is twofold. It's don't politicize them by revealing who appointed them, but do tell us who appointed them because we want to know. And I'm sort of curious, with your advocacy and your empowering state courts and empowering other people, what do you suggest to the press? How do we cover this without over politicizing the issue, without leaving people in the dark about information?
That's a really good question, because that's the tricky wicket of including party ID on the ballot for judges, because on one hand, it makes it partisan and politicizes it, but people want more information. People don't have information about judicial candidates, and they're desperate for it. So that's sorry, you guys talk.
When they go
Hard
low, we
question.
go high. So, I don't necessarily recommend, talking about their party ID or who appointed them. We should continue to expect that our state courts, really should be nonpartisan and that they're there. Look, judges don't wear blue robes or red robes. They wear black robes because they are there to uphold the rule of law. Are there people trying to politicize the courts? Absolutely. But it is our job to not do that and to keep ensuring that we have fair and impartial courts that are there to uphold the rule of law.
I'll say that a lot of judicial selection systems were also designed to encourage the kind of independence that everyone's talking about. And so often who appointed the judge is actually not a good proxy for that judge's politics. Kansas is a really good example. A number of the justices who've been involved in their decisions about abortion access or school funding were appointed by very conservative governors. It's just that the nominating commission there is really independent and sort of doing the job it's supposed to do. And so if you were to say that this was a brown back appointed justice, I think you might actually be misdirecting some readers.
Hi, my name is Nairobi Craddock. I'm with People's Parity Project. You all are talking a lot about organizing and being creative. Can you mention some groups that you've done the outreach to who have been really receptive? For some of the abortion panels or the nurses have been really receptive and have really helped us move the ball. Who are some groups in your individual states or just across the board that have really they've heard these calls for judicial reform and they've really accepted it and helped you move the ball?
In Tennessee, we had the two groups that I can think of right now that were incredibly helpful were groups of lawyers as well as small business owners. We had small business owners pull out a petition that resulted in over 800 signatures. And those signatures created media press, and media got a hold of the fact that small business owners care about our courts. And that created a lot of talk and a lot of earned media as well. And once you start beginning to earn that media, you can start mobilizing around the attention that is being created around that issue in the state. And so those are the two groups that really supported our efforts, but also my organization sits at a statewide table, and we utilized all of our partners across the table, across the state, to push for different types of organizing so that we're tackling every single facet of organizing at the same time. We didn't have a lot of time to organize. We had about 3.5 weeks before this piece of legislation was going to go through. And so it was a really quick turnaround, so we were able to utilize these different groups, these different organizations to push our message across.
And I'll jump in there and say, back to my comment I made earlier about all the various issues we care about, to add the courts onto that. So there's lots of unlikely partners as well. So you may want to throw down on one issue together, and maybe you don't agree with a certain organization about other things, but this one situation, you all agree. I can say that when we were fighting against House Bill 38 in Pennsylvania, we had a huge fight back table of trial lawyers, unions, good government groups. There's just a wide array of folks who wanted to throw down together to fight against one bad bill. And we didn't know if we were the D's or the R's. We just knew that House Bill 38 was problematic for everybody, and we all got together. The last thing I'll say is, when you talk about various organizations, I spent doing this education work, just educating folks and meeting them where they are and talking to them about the courts. I did a educational session for the NAACP, a branch in Pennsylvania. And we were talking about the federal courts, and I was laying out all the issues and all the problems that were happening in the federal and state courts. And one person said in the meeting, when are we going to get bloody again? Right? When are we going to get bloody again? We keep talking about these issues and nothing is happening. When are we going to, talking about John Lewis and Selma, right? Bloody Sunday. When are we going to get bloody about these issues that we care about? And that really sparked a movement for us in Pennsylvania to really advocate for the independence of our courts, is hearing that from groups that have been fighting for civil rights and human rights for so many years. So I think look to your unlikely partners, because there are some. And then also think about all the issues you care about, reach out to that. If you're fighting about Roe, reach out to your Planned Parenthood, reach out to your NARALs. If you're concerned about the environment, you reach out to your Penn Futures and your conservation voters or whoever it may be. So whatever the issue is, there's another organization that's doing work around that. It's just Part B.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm with Alliance for Justice. But thank you all for hosting this panel. And I know you briefly talked about the importance of demographic diversity on these benches. Can you also speak to the importance of professional and experiential diversity on these state Supreme Courts?
Sure, I can take that quickly. The sort of one of the big focuses over the last few years of ours and many other groups has been calling attention to the need for greater professional diversity on courts of all levels. It was so common for judges to be prosecutors or corporate law partners, and that was pretty much it. That's who got appointed, especially in appointment circumstances. But there is so much research showing that all the experience people bring to the bench informs their decisions. One really important report was put out by Demand Justice a couple of years ago, which looked at those justices who were former prosecutors and corporate attorneys versus everyone else, and it looked at employment law cases. So you're thinking, it's an employment law case, employment discrimination. Whether someone's a prosecutor shouldn't really impact their decision in that case. But what that study found was that the prosecutors were much more likely to side with the power, with the large employer, and against the person who was suffering or claiming the discrimination, which again is just a telling piece of information about how prior experiences inform actual judicial decisions. And so there's been, maybe governors have been aware of the need to focus on demographic diversity for 5 to 10 years, and they've been willing to talk about that when making their judicial appointments. But you're only just now starting to see the door open to talking more robustly about what diversity means and what representation means on these courts. And it's so important that sort of people keep pounding the door on that.
And I've been told that's the end, so I want to wrap it up. I thank you all, wonderful panelists. Please give them a round of applause. And thank you all for coming. Please, they use our ignorance? Is that, what did you say?
Oh, yeah. What was that quote? The ignorance quote.
Oh, they count on our ignorance.
They count on our ignorance. So we're not going to be ignorant anymore, right?
Yeah, let's not be ignorant.
There you go. All right, thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thanks.
Can you get your staff to take a picture of all this?